Elizabeth sat up abruptly in bed, breathing heavily. Her nightgown clung to her back, covered in cold sweat. In the darkness of the bedroom, she frantically tried to find the switch for the bedside lamp. "God, it's happening again," she whispered as the room filled with soft light. Liz squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. James' face, distorted with pain and fear, still lingered before her eyes. "What's happening to me?" she muttered, massaging her temples. It was the third dream like this in a week. Each time she woke up with a sense of anxiety and inexplicable fear. Liz got out of bed and walked to the window. The night city was unusually quiet. She stared into the darkness, trying to find answers to the questions that haunted her even in her sleep. "James," she whispered softly, "I miss you so much." Suddenly, the phone rang, startling Elizabeth. She grabbed the receiver, allowing herself a moment of hope that this was a mistake, that James was still alive. "Hello, James." Her voice trembled with excitement. "Liz, it's Sarah. I'm sorry for calling so late, but I felt I had to check on you. Are you okay?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to hide her disappointment. "Sarah." "Yes, No, actually, I'm not okay. These dreams, they are becoming more real." "Tell me," Sarah gently urged. "I see James. He dies over and over again, Sarah. I feel it with every fiber of my being. But I can't help him. I can't change what happened." "Liz, sweetheart, it's been 3 months. You have to." "Don't tell me I have to let him go," Elizabeth snapped. "You don't understand. These dreams, they're not just nightmares. They mean something, I'm sure of it." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah cautiously said, "Maybe you should talk to someone? I can recommend a good therapist." Elizabeth bitterly chuckled. "You think I've lost my mind?" "No, of course not. I'm just worried about you. You hardly leave the house. You don't talk to anyone." "I know, Sarah. I'm trying, really. But how can I pretend that everything is okay when I feel like James? Like he's still here, like he's trying to tell me something." "Liz, listen to me. James loved you more than anything. He wouldn't want you to suffer like this. You have to think about yourself and how to live on." Elizabeth wiped away her tears. "You're right. I'll try. Thank you for calling." After the conversation with Sarah, Liz couldn't sleep. She went down to the kitchen and brewed some tea, trying to gather her thoughts. Her gaze fell on a family photo on the fridge. James was hugging her, both of them smiling at the camera. "Where are you, my love?" Elizabeth whispered, tracing her finger over her husband's face in the photo. "Why can't I let you go?" Suddenly, the memory of that fateful day 3 months ago surfaced. James was getting ready for work, as usual. Elizabeth remembered every detail of that morning. "Liz, have you seen my badge?" James peeked out of the bedroom, buttoning his shirt. Elizabeth smiled at the confused look on her husband's face. "It's on the dresser, where you always leave it." James slapped his forehead. "Right. What would I do without you?" "You'd be late for work every day," she teased, handing him a cup of coffee. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her gently. "I'm the happiest man in the world, you know that?" Liz hugged him back, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "I'm happy too, James. Please, be careful today." He pulled back and looked into her eyes. "Hey, what's wrong? I'm always careful. I know, it's just, I have a strange feeling." James hugged her again. "Everything will be fine, darling. I promise." Elizabeth nodded, trying to smile. "Of course. Just silly thoughts. Goodbye, love." James blew her a kiss and left. If only she had known then that this would be their last conversation. All day, she couldn't shake the strange feeling of dread. She kept glancing at the clock, waiting for her husband to return. When the hands of the clock passed midnight and James still hadn't come home, Liz felt something inside her break. Elizabeth returned to the living room and dialed her husband's number again. Unavailable. "James, where are you?" she whispered, feeling panic rise with each passing minute. Suddenly, the silence of the house was shattered by an ominous knock at the window. Elizabeth shuddered, feeling a chill run down her spine. Slowly turning around, she saw a large black raven perched on the windowsill. Its eyes, like two bottomless black pits, gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight. The bird, as if obeying some unknown force, flew into the room. The air around it seemed to thicken and darken. The raven landed silently on the kitchen table, its claws leaving faint marks on the polished surface. Elizabeth froze, unable to move. She could feel an invisible energy pulsing between her and the bird. The raven stared directly into her eyes, and at that moment Liz felt a strange burning sensation in her temples. It was as if ancient, long-forgotten knowledge was trying to break through the veil of her consciousness. Suddenly, the raven let out a piercing cry, causing the windows to rattle. At that same moment, something fell with a crash from a distant shelf in the living room. Elizabeth, as if in a trance, slowly approached the source of the sound. On the floor lay her and James' wedding photo, the glass frame cracked precisely between their smiling faces. Liz felt an invisible hand squeeze her heart. The raven, having completed its mission, flapped its wings and flew out of the window. Not fully aware of her actions, obeying some instinct, Elizabeth grabbed her coat and ran after it. Bursting onto the street, she found herself in a completely different world. Familiar streets now seemed strange and hostile. Shadows lengthened as if trying to grasp her, and the air became thick and heavy. Elizabeth's heart pounded so hard that it felt like it would leap out of her chest. She didn't understand why she was following the bird, but she felt it was her destiny. Deep down, she knew this was the only thread connecting her to the missing James. "James," she whispered, her voice sounding strange in the unnatural silence. "Where are you? What happened to you?" The raven flew ahead, its silhouette sharply outlined against the full moon. Elizabeth, as if in a trance, followed it. The streets changed one after another, but Liz didn't notice. The whole world had narrowed to this strange chase. Suddenly, the bird disappeared into the darkness, and Liz found herself in front of an abandoned house. Her heart clenched with inexplicable fear. In the dim moonlight, she noticed a police car. The lights were still flashing, cutting through the darkness with ominous red and blue bursts. The silence was broken by the crackling of a radio left in the car. Someone's desperate voice was trying to reach the officer. "Patrol 27, respond. Detective Harper, can you hear me? Over." Elizabeth froze, hearing her husband's last name. Taking a step forward, she felt something underfoot. Kneeling down, she found a small hard object in the grass. Her heart stopped when she realized she was holding a bullet. With trembling hands, Elizabeth took out her phone and dialed the emergency number. 911, what's your emergency? I found an abandoned police car. Something happened here. Please, send someone, her voice quivered. After giving the address, Liz moved forward, lighting her way with her phone. Suddenly, the beam of light caught the outline of a human body. "Oh God, no!" Elizabeth whispered, rushing forward. As she got closer, she recognized James. He was lying on the ground, his shirt soaked with blood. "James!" she screamed, falling to her knees beside him. "James, darling, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, and he struggled to open his eyes. "Liz." His voice was barely audible. How did you find me?" "Sure, don't speak." Elizabeth pressed her hands to his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Help is on the way. You have to hold on, do you hear me?" James smiled weakly. "You always find me. Don't you dare say goodbye," Liz said through tears. "You can't leave me, do you hear? We still have so much to do. Remember, we wanted to go to Italy. You promised to teach me how to make pasta." James lifted his hand and touched her face. "Forgive me, my love. I love you so much." "No, no, no." Elizabeth desperately held him closer. "James, please, hold on. I love you, do you hear? Don't leave me." But his hand fell lifelessly, and his eyes closed. Elizabeth screamed and begged him to wake up, but James no longer responded. In the distance, the sound of ambulance sirens echoed, but it was already too late. Elizabeth sat on the ground, cradling her husband's body and crying silently. She didn't notice the black raven appear again on the branch of a nearby tree, watching the scene with its gleaming eyes. That was where Elizabeth's memories ended, leaving behind only a dull ache and a sense of irreparable loss. Elizabeth slowly emerged from the stupor her memories had cast her into. The room around her gradually came into focus, and she found herself sitting on the living room floor, clutching a photo of James to her chest. The clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning. Sleep no longer came. With a heavy sigh, Liz stood up. Her gaze involuntarily slid towards the door at the end of the hallway. That was where her office was, a place that had become both a refuge and a prison over the past few months. Elizabeth hesitated. She knew that entering there would once again plunge her into a whirlpool of pain and obsession. But the alternative seemed even worse, sitting in silence, allowing memories and despair to consume her. Making up her mind, she headed toward the office. The door creaked open softly, as if protesting the intrusion at such a late hour. The room greeted Elizabeth with familiar chaos. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings. The desk was buried under papers and folders. Empty coffee cups were scattered everywhere, silent witnesses to the sleepless nights spent here. Liz turned on the desk lamp, and shadows danced on the walls. Her gaze instinctively landed on the large photo of James at the center of the wall. He was smiling, looking directly at the camera, and his eyes shone with the joy of life that Elizabeth had loved so much. "I will find whoever did this, James," she whispered, touching the photo with her fingers. "I promise." Elizabeth sat down at the desk and began sorting through the papers. There was the autopsy report. She knew it by heart, but still reread it over and over, hoping to find something new. 2 bullets, 1 fatal. No signs of a struggle. James either knew his killer or was taken by surprise. Next to it was a stack of newspaper clippings. The headline screamed, "Detective killed in the line of duty. Police at a dead end. Officer's killer still at large. A year later, Detective Harper's murder remains unsolved." Elizabeth felt the anger boil inside her. How could they just give up? How could they let James's killer walk free? She reached for the file on the case James had been working on before his death. Officially, the investigation was closed. Not enough evidence, they said. But Elizabeth knew the answer had to be here. The case involved a series of robberies that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. But James had noticed a pattern. He was convinced that one group was behind them all, and he was close to uncovering them. Elizabeth spread the photos of the suspects across the table. She knew their faces better than her own. Mark Donovan, a petty thief who suddenly got rich. Alex Reynolds, a former security guard fired for negligence. Sarah Lang, a hacker known in certain circles. Which of them could be the killer? Or was it someone else, someone they had missed? Liz rubbed her tired eyes. She felt the answer was close, but it kept slipping away from her. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to one of the crime scene photos. It depicted the empty lot where James's body had been found. Something about the photo seemed off, but Elizabeth couldn't figure out what it was. She picked up a magnifying glass and began to study the image closely. There were the tire tracks from the police car, the trampled grass where James had lain, and a knock on the window made Elizabeth jump. She turned sharply and froze. On the windowsill sat a black raven. The very same raven that had led her to James that fateful night. Elizabeth's heart raced. She blinked, thinking it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief. But the raven didn't disappear. It sat still, watching her with its gleaming eyes. Liz slowly stood and approached the window. The raven didn't move. It looked at her as if it were waiting for something. With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the window. Cold night air rushed into the room, ruffling the papers on the desk. But the raven didn't fly away. Instead, it calmly hopped from the windowsill to the desk. "You," Elizabeth whispered, unable to believe her eyes. "Is it really you?" The raven tilted its head as if in response. Its eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This was madness. The bird couldn't be the same one. It was just a coincidence, a trick of a grief-stricken mind. But something inside her knew. It was the same raven. "Why are you here?" Liz asked, feeling a little foolish for talking to a bird. "Do you want to show me something again?" Of course, the raven didn't answer. Instead, it turned toward the photos and documents spread across the desk. Its gaze seemed to linger on the crime scene photo, the very one Elizabeth had been studying a moment ago. Liz hesitantly stepped closer. "What do you see? What am I missing?" The raven pecked at the photograph. Elizabeth bent down to get a better look. And then she saw it. In the corner of the picture, almost unnoticeable among the grass, lay some object. Something shiny and metallic. "How could I have missed this?" Elizabeth breathed out, grabbing a magnifying glass. Under magnification, she could make out the contours of the object. It was a cufflink. An unusual cufflink with an engraving of a snake. Elizabeth felt a wave of adrenaline rush through her body. This was a clue. The first real clue in all these months. She quickly began going through the files of suspects. Did any of them have such a cufflink? She didn't remember seeing anything like it before. The raven watched her, unmoving. Its presence strangely calmed Elizabeth, giving her strength. Suddenly, she froze. In Alex Reynolds' file, the former guard, there was a photo from some formal event. A cufflink was visible on his sleeve. Elizabeth grabbed the magnifying glass and held it up to the photo. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the one. The same cufflink with the snake. "My God," Elizabeth whispered. "It's him. It has to be him." She turned to the raven, feeling the excitement growing in her chest. "You led me to this, didn't you? You knew." The raven blinked, and Elizabeth could swear she saw a glimmer of understanding in its eyes. Liz grabbed her phone, ready to call the detective handling James' case. But she stopped. It was almost 1 in the morning. Besides, would they even believe her? A cufflink in a blurry photograph was unlikely to be considered serious evidence by the police. No, she needed to find more proof. She needed to follow Reynolds, find that cufflink, maybe even... Elizabeth cut off the thought. She understood how dangerous what she was thinking could be. But did she have a choice? The police hadn't been able to find James' killer. Maybe she had to do it herself. The raven suddenly flew up and landed on the windowsill. It turned to Elizabeth as if waiting for her decision. Liz took a deep breath. She knew it was madness. She knew it was dangerous. But she also knew she couldn't live without knowing the truth. "All right," she said to the raven. "Lead me." The bird, as if understanding her words, flew out the window. Elizabeth quickly grabbed her jacket and car keys. Throwing one last glance at James' photograph, she whispered, "I'll find him, darling. I swear I'll find whoever did this." With these words, she ran out of the office, ready to follow the raven wherever it led her. When Elizabeth rushed outside, the cool night air hit her face as if trying to sober her up. But she was determined. The raven circled above her and then flew towards the darker part of town. Liz quickly got into her car and followed, trying not to lose sight of the bird. Part of her mind screamed about the insanity of what was happening, but another part, the one tied to James by an invisible thread, knew this was her only chance to uncover the truth. The city outside the window gradually changed. Well-kept houses gave way to dilapidated buildings, bright storefronts to boarded-up windows. Elizabeth found herself in an industrial area where work bustled during the day, but a sinister silence reigned at night. The raven suddenly veered and landed on the roof of an old warehouse. Liz parked her car in the shadows and got out, carefully looking around. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo through the deserted streets. As she approached the warehouse, she noticed a dim light seeping through the cracks in the doors. Someone was inside. Elizabeth pressed herself against the wall, trying to hear anything. Muffled voices came from inside. She could make out a male voice that sounded familiar. Creeping closer to a window, Liz cautiously peered inside. Her heart skipped a beat. In the dim light, she saw Alex Reynolds. He was talking to 2 men Elizabeth didn't recognize. On the table in front of them were some papers and weapons. "This is our last job," she heard Reynolds say. "After this, we disappear. No loose ends." One of the men nervously glanced around. What if the cops start digging again? What if that detective's wife? Elizabeth held her breath and continued listening to the conversation inside the warehouse. She realized this was her chance to get proof of Reynolds' involvement in James' murder. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and started recording the video through the crack in the wall. "She knows nothing," Reynolds continued, his voice cold and confident. "The police closed the case long ago. No one connects us to the murder of that cop. Elizabeth's heart raced faster. This was it, the confession she had been waiting for. She tried to hold the phone as steady as possible, afraid to miss a word. "What if she finds something?" the other man asked. "This woman has been persistent for a long time." Reynolds smirked. "If she becomes a problem, we'll deal with her just like we did with her husband." At that moment, Elizabeth, standing on tiptoes, accidentally knocked a small stone with her foot. The sound seemed to echo like a gunshot in the night. Silence fell inside the warehouse. "What was that?" came a tense whisper. Elizabeth recoiled from the wall, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She heard approaching footsteps and realized she needed to run. Turning around, she dashed away from the warehouse but dropped her phone in the process. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed through the empty street. "There's someone there!" came a shout from behind her. Elizabeth froze for a split second. The phone with the video was her only evidence. She couldn't leave it behind. Quickly turning back, she rushed for the phone. That split-second delay was enough for Reynolds and his men to run out of the warehouse. They saw Elizabeth just as she grabbed the phone. "It's her, the cop's wife," Reynolds shouted. "Get her." Elizabeth ran, clutching the phone in her hand. Gunshots rang out behind her. Bullets whizzed past, sparking off the asphalt. Liz ran with all her strength towards her car parked at the end of the street. Her lungs burned, and blood pounded in her temples. She could hear the footsteps of her pursuers. They were closing in fast. Just a few more meters to the car when Elizabeth felt a sharp blow to her head. The world spun, and she fell to the asphalt. The phone slipped from her hand and skidded away. Fighting through the pain and dizziness, Liz tried to get up. But a heavy hand shoved her back down. Standing over her were Reynolds and his two accomplices. "Well, Mrs. Detective, had your fun?" Reynolds smirked, pointing the gun at her. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong for far too long." Elizabeth stared into the barrel of the gun, her whole life flashing before her eyes. James, their happy days together, his death, months of desperate searching for the truth. Could it all really end like this? "Please," she whispered, feeling tears stream down her cheeks. "You've already taken James from me. Isn't that enough?" Reynolds shook his head. "Sorry, darling. Nothing personal. Just business." At that moment, something inside Elizabeth seemed to break. Fear and despair were replaced by something else, ancient, powerful, incomprehensible. She closed her eyes and let out a scream that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. This scream wasn't just an expression of fear or pain. In it echoed the voice of millennia, the call of nature that hadn't been heard in this world for a long, long time. Reynolds and his men recoiled, stunned by the sheer power of the scream. And then something incredible began to happen. The sky, which had been clear and starry just moments ago, suddenly started to darken. Clouds, appearing as if from nowhere, rapidly covered the horizon. The wind, which had been barely noticeable before, now howled, swirling around them. And then they came. At first, it was just a few dark silhouettes against the restless sky. But with each passing second, there were more and more of them. Crows. Hundreds, thousands of crows flocked from all sides, as if responding to a silent summons. Their wings blotted out the last glimmers of stars, turning the night into impenetrable darkness. Reynolds and his accomplices stared in horror at the unfolding spectacle. Their confidence and cruelty were replaced by panic. "What the hell is this?" one of them shouted, frantically looking around. But Elizabeth no longer heard them. She lay on the ground, her eyes closed, her lips silently moving as if uttering some ancient incantation. The crows circled above them, forming a living, moving dome of darkness. Their cawing merged into a deafening chorus that seemed to shake the very earth. Reynolds, trying to regain his composure, aimed the gun at Elizabeth once again. "Stop this," he yelled. "Stop them, or I'll shoot." But at that moment, something happened that would change the lives of everyone present forever. The crows, as if obeying a silent command, dove down. Thousands of black wings surrounded Reynolds and his men. Their screams of terror were drowned out by the sound of countless flapping wings. The gun fell from Reynolds' trembling hands as he desperately tried to fend off the attacking birds. Elizabeth slowly rose to her feet. When she opened her eyes, they glowed with a strange, otherworldly light. She watched the scene unfold with a mixture of wonder and some ancient understanding. The crows circled around her but did not harm her. They seemed to be waiting for her command. "What are you?" Reynolds cried out in horror, trying to shield himself from the attacking birds. Elizabeth looked at him, and in her gaze was the wisdom of the ages. "I am the one who seeks justice," she said in a voice that seemed not entirely her own. "And you will answer for your crimes." She raised her hand, and the crows, as if obeying a silent order, retreated, forming a dense circle around Reynolds and his men. Elizabeth approached her phone, which lay on the ground. The screen was cracked, but the device still worked. The video capturing Reynolds' confession had been saved. "You thought you could escape justice," she said, looking at the terrified men. "But there are forces greater than human laws. And today, those forces demand justice." In the distance, the sound of police sirens could be heard. Someone from the nearby area must have called the police after hearing the gunshots. Elizabeth looked at the crows still surrounding Reynolds and his accomplices. "Hold them here," she quietly commanded. The birds, seeming to understand the order, closed ranks around the criminals, preventing them from fleeing. When the first police cars appeared on the street, they witnessed an incredible scene. 3 men surrounded by a dense ring of crows and a woman standing before them with a phone in her hand. "I'm Elizabeth Harper," she said to the approaching officers. "And I have evidence of the murder of my husband, Detective James Harper." While the police, shocked by what they saw, arrested Reynolds and his accomplices, Elizabeth felt the ancient power slowly leaving her. The crows, having completed their mission, began to disperse, dissolving into the night sky. The last to leave was the very crow that had led her here. It lingered for a moment, looking directly into Elizabeth's eyes, and she thought she saw approval and farewell in its gaze. When the bird disappeared from sight, Elizabeth felt tears well up in her throat. But these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of relief and release. "I did it, James," she whispered, gazing up at the night sky. "I found your killer. Now you can rest in peace." Several months had passed since that fateful night. The trial of Reynolds and his accomplices had been long and grueling, but justice had prevailed. This morning, the court delivered a guilty verdict, finding them responsible for the murder of Detective James Harper and a number of other crimes. Elizabeth stood in front of the courthouse, feeling a strange emptiness inside. She had thought this moment would bring her relief, but instead, she felt only fatigue and uncertainty. "What now?" she asked herself, staring at the gray sky. Without thinking, she got into her car and drove to the cemetery. She needed to talk to James, to tell him what had happened, even if it was just a conversation with a cold stone. The cemetery greeted her with silence and coolness. Elizabeth slowly walked along the familiar path, holding a bouquet of white lilies, James's favorite flowers. Her husband's grave was as it had always been, a neat granite stone engraved with his name and dates. Elizabeth knelt before the headstone, laid the flowers down, and ran her hand over the cold stone. "Hi, my love," she said softly. "I came to tell you the news. We did it, James. Reynolds and his men have been found guilty. They won't hurt anyone anymore." Elizabeth fell silent, gathering her thoughts. The wind gently rustled the leaves of the trees, and she thought she heard the distant cawing of a crow. "You know, I often think about that night," she continued. "About the crows, about the power I felt. It was so strange, James. It was as if a part of me I didn't know about suddenly awoke. Sometimes I think it was just a dream, a hallucination from stress. But then I remember Reynolds' gaze, his fear. It was real, wasn't it?" Elizabeth sighed, leaning against the gravestone. "I miss you so much, James. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking you're beside me. I feel your presence, as if you're still here with me." "Because I am here, Liz." Elizabeth froze. That voice. She knew it better than her own. But it was impossible. "James," she whispered, afraid to turn around. "Yes, my love. It's me." Elizabeth's heart was beating so fast that it seemed ready to jump out of her chest. Slowly, very slowly, she turned around. And there, standing right before her, was James. But it wasn't the James she remembered. He seemed to be woven from light and shadow, translucent and unreal. But his eyes were as alive and full of love as she remembered them. "Is it really you?" Elizabeth reached out her hand but stopped, afraid that the vision would disappear. James smiled the same smile she loved so much. "Yes, Liz. I know it's hard to understand, but I'm here. I've always been here with you." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "But how? Why now?" "Because now you're ready to see me," James answered softly. "Liz, what happened that night with the crows was only the beginning. There's a power within you, ancient and mighty. A power that will help you uncover the truth." Elizabeth frowned. "What are you talking about?" "We found your killer. Reynolds has been convicted." James shook his head. "Reynolds and his men are just the tip of the iceberg. They're not the only ones responsible for my death. There's something else, Liz. Something much bigger than we could have imagined." What is it?" Elizabeth felt that same feeling stir inside her again, the one she experienced on the night of the crows. "I can't tell you everything," James replied. "There are rules, laws that even I can't break. But I can guide you. Liz, you need to go to my office." "Your office?" "But everything there has been checked over 100 times." "Not everything," James smiled. "Do you remember that old painting you hated so much? The one with the boat in the storm?" Elizabeth nodded, remembering the ugly painting James had refused to take down for some reason. "There's a safe behind it. The combination is the date of our wedding. Inside, you'll find a file. I didn't have time to finish that investigation, but you can. It will lead you to the truth, Liz. The real reason behind everything that happened." Elizabeth wanted to ask so many more questions, but she could feel that time was running out. James was starting to fade, his form becoming less distinct. "James, don't go!" she cried, trying to hold on to him. "I'm always with you, my love," his voice echoed from afar. "Remember your power. Trust it. And be careful. They won't stop at anything." With those words, James' image dissolved into the air, leaving Elizabeth alone in front of the cold gravestone. She abruptly opened her eyes, breathing heavily. Her heart was pounding, and beads of sweat ran down her forehead. Elizabeth looked around. She was in her bedroom, and the sun was just beginning to rise outside the window. "Was it a dream?" she whispered, trying to gather her thoughts. But something inside her knew. It was more than just a dream. She felt it with every cell of her body. Without hesitating for a second, Elizabeth jumped out of bed and began to get dressed. She needed to go to James' office immediately. The morning city was just beginning to wake up when Elizabeth arrived at the police station. Despite the early hour, a few cars were already parked. Crime knows no weekends. Elizabeth confidently walked through the familiar lobby, nodding to the on-duty officer. Over the past year, she had become a frequent visitor here, and her appearance no longer surprised anyone. James' office was on the 3rd floor. The door was locked, but Elizabeth had a key, the only thing she had asked to keep after her husband's death. Stepping inside, she froze for a moment. The room looked exactly the same as on the day of James' death. It seemed as if time had stopped here. His papers were still on the desk, his favorite coat hung on the rack and on the wall. Elizabeth turned to the very painting James had mentioned in her dream. The ugly boat struggling against the storm. She had never understood why James was so attached to this painting. Her heart raced as she took the painting off the wall. And indeed, behind it, she found a small safe. "The date of our wedding," Elizabeth whispered, entering the combination. The safe opened with a quiet click. Inside was a loan folder, without any identifying marks. With trembling hands, Elizabeth took out the folder and opened it. The first thing she saw was James' handwriting, so familiar that her heart ached with pain. "Operation Chimera," she read the title on the first page. The more she read, the greater her astonishment and horror grew. James had been investigating something far more serious than simple robberies. There were mentions of corrupt politicians, secret deals with drug cartels, millions of dollars flowing through shell companies. And names. The names of people Elizabeth knew. People who had come to James' funeral and offered her their condolences. "Oh my God, James," she whispered. "What did you get yourself into?" Suddenly, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was approaching the office. Elizabeth quickly closed the folder and pressed it to her chest. She knew she couldn't leave it here. It was too important, too dangerous. As the door began to open, Elizabeth was already standing by the window, pretending to look out at the city. "Mrs. Harper." It was Captain Brown, James's superior. "I didn't expect to see you here so early." Elizabeth turned, trying to look calm. "Good morning, Captain. I just wanted to be here for a bit. After yesterday's verdict." Captain Brown nodded understandingly. "Of course, I understand. It must be hard for you." "Yes, a bit." Elizabeth tried to smile. "But I'm leaving now. Thank you for letting me come here." She headed towards the exit, tightly clutching the bag with the folder inside. "Mrs. Harper," Captain Brown called as she reached the door. "I know it's been a long investigation, but now it's over. Maybe you should move on." Elizabeth looked at him, and for a moment she thought she saw something strange in his eyes. Fear? Concern? "Of course, Captain," she replied. "I'm working on it." As she left the building, Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew this was just the beginning. James had left her the key to a mystery that had cost him his life. And now it was her duty to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Clutching the bag with the folder, Elizabeth headed to her car. She felt that strange power stirring inside her again. The power that James had called ancient and powerful. "I will find the truth, James," she whispered, looking at the sky where a solitary raven circled high. "I promise." Months of investigation had blended into one endless day for Elizabeth, filled with searches, doubts, and unexpected discoveries. With each new fact, with each solved mystery, she felt her inner strength growing. The very strength James had spoken of. She had learned to listen to her intuition, which now seemed as sharp as a razor. Sometimes, in moments of intense tension, Elizabeth noticed ravens gathering around her, as if ready to come to her aid at her first call. James's investigation, Operation Chimera, turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay a network of corruption that reached the highest echelons of city power. Politicians, businessmen, even some police officers, all were part of this colossal mechanism. James had come too close to the truth, and paid for it with his life. But he had left enough clues for Elizabeth to continue his work. And now the day had come when the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Elizabeth sat in her apartment, surrounded by documents, photos, and notes. A huge chart on the wall connected names, dates, and events with red threads. "Here it is," she whispered, looking at the name at the center of the chart. The city mayor, Richard Caldwell. A man she knew personally, who had given a speech at James's funeral. Elizabeth felt a wave of anger and determination rise within her. She knew what she had to do, but she also understood how dangerous it was. Taking out her phone, she dialed the number of the only person in the police she still trusted, young Detective Michael Rodriguez, James's former partner. "Michael, it's Elizabeth. I've found them. All of them. I need your help." An hour later, Elizabeth stood before Mayor Caldwell's luxurious mansion. Her heart was pounding like crazy, but she felt a strange calmness, as if her entire existence had led to this moment. Before entering, she dialed 911. "Police. I want to report a crime. Send a unit to this address." Hanging up, Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew she was risking her life, but she could no longer hide. The truth had to come out, no matter what. The guard at the entrance recognized her. After all, she was the widow of a well-known detective. "Mrs. Harper, how can I help you?" "I need to see Mayor Caldwell. It's urgent." Something in her voice made the guard comply without further questions. A few minutes later, Elizabeth was standing in the mayor's opulent office. Richard Caldwell looked surprised and slightly irritated by her sudden appearance. "Mrs. Harper, what brings you here at this hour?" Elizabeth looked him straight in the eye. "I know everything, Mr. Caldwell. About Chimera, about the corruption, about my husband's murder. About everything." The mayor's face briefly contorted, but he quickly composed himself. "I don't understand what you're talking about. Perhaps you should get some rest. Losing a husband is a heavy burden, and sometimes our minds can play cruel tricks on us." "Don't pretend." Elizabeth pulled out the folder with documents from her bag. "I have evidence. All your dirty deals, all the murders. James uncovered everything, and you killed him for it." Caldwell turned pale. His hand reached for the desk drawer, but Elizabeth was quicker. "Don't even think about it," she said. "The police are already on their way. It's over." At that moment, the office door swung open, and two men in expensive suits entered. Elizabeth recognized them, the deputy mayor and the city police chief. "What the hell is going on here?" the police chief barked. Mayor Caldwell seemed to snap out of it. His face twisted into a malicious grimace. "She knows everything. Get rid of her." Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The men drew their weapons and opened fire. Elizabeth heard the shots, felt the bullets hit her, but strangely, she felt no pain. Instead, she felt that ancient power awaken inside her. A black mist, like raven feathers, appeared around her body. The bullets seemed to dissolve in the mist, causing her no harm. Outside, there was a loud rustling of wings. Hundreds, thousands of ravens flocked to the mansion, trying to get inside. Their cries echoed through the night, filling the hearts of those present with primal terror. But Elizabeth knew this was her battle. She had to finish what James had started with her own hands. Elizabeth's movements became unnaturally fast. She was next to the deputy mayor before he could blink. With one precise blow, she broke his arm, which was holding the gun. The man screamed in pain and fell to his knees. The police chief tried to aim again, but Elizabeth was already beside him. She knocked the weapon from his hands and broke his leg with a powerful strike. The sound of the breaking bone echoed through the office. Mayor Caldwell, in a panic, tried to get out from behind the desk, but Elizabeth grabbed him by the collar and pressed him against the wall. "You will pay for everything," she hissed. "For every life you destroyed. For James." At that moment, the police officers led by Michael Rodriguez burst into the office. They stood at the threshold, stunned by what they saw. Elizabeth felt the power leaving her. The black mist dissipated, and she sank to the floor, weak and exhausted. Only then did she feel the pain from her injuries. Blood began to seep through her clothes. "Ambulance! Immediately!" Michael shouted, rushing to her. As paramedics attended to her, Elizabeth watched as the mayor and his accomplices were arrested. She had done it. She had completed James's mission. She had restored justice. As she was wheeled on a stretcher to the ambulance, Elizabeth saw him. The same raven sat on a lamppost, watching the scene. She smiled and whispered, "Thank you. For everything." It seemed to Elizabeth that the raven nodded before flying off into the night sky. Recovery was long and difficult. Physical wounds healed faster than emotional ones. But with each passing day, Elizabeth felt her desire to live returning. The trial of Mayor Caldwell and his accomplices became a sensation. Dozens of crimes, corruption schemes, and contract murders were uncovered. The city seemed to be cleansed of years of grime. Elizabeth became a hero in the public's eyes. She was offered to write a book, make a film about her story. But she declined. All she wanted was peace. After being discharged from the hospital, Elizabeth decided to start a new life. She sold the apartment where she had lived with James and bought a small house on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by trees where crows liked to perch. She tried to forget about the mysticism, about the incredible power that had awakened within her. But completely ignoring what had happened was impossible. Crows became her constant companions. They came every day, and Elizabeth always kept food for them. Sometimes, sitting on the porch and watching the birds, she thought about James. Whether he would have been proud of her. Whether he had found peace. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Elizabeth began working at the local library, made new friends. She no longer felt the crushing emptiness that had plagued her after her husband's death. Years went by. Elizabeth grew older, but her eyes retained the same sparkle as in her youth. Children from the neighboring houses loved to visit her, to listen to stories and feed the crows, which seemed to fearlessly stay near her. One evening, many years later, Elizabeth sat in her favorite chair on the porch. The sunset painted the sky in amazing shades of gold and purple. The crows, as usual, perched on the nearby trees. She felt an extraordinary sense of tranquility, as if everything in her life had finally fallen into place. "I lived a good life, James," she said softly, looking at the sky. "I hope you are proud of me." The wind gently brushed her hair, and for a moment Elizabeth thought she heard a familiar voice, Always proud, my love." She smiled and closed her eyes. The crows in the trees flapped their wings as if paying their final respects. Elizabeth Harper passed away quietly and peacefully, surrounded by her faithful crow companions. She left behind a legend of a woman who challenged corruption and won, of a widow who completed her husband's work, of a person who found the strength to start life anew. And the crows. They continued to come to her house for many years, as if guarding the memory of the extraordinary woman who once awakened an ancient power within herself and changed the fate of an entire city. And if you ever see a crow watching you closely, who knows? Maybe it holds a piece of that same power that once helped Elizabeth Harper restore justice and find her way to a new life.